The sky turned black, and then the screaming started. 100,000 elite warriors marched to erase a nation, only to walk into a psychological slaughterhouse. Zero mercy, zero escape. While a terrifying eclipse blinded the world, the soil itself began to swallow the most powerful army on earth. This wasn't a battle. It was a technical erasing of an empire's soul. One single error triggered a nightmare so brutal it was scrubbed from history for centuries. 100,000 soldiers. This is not just an army. It is a living wall of flesh, steel, and fanatical faith stretching for 15 kilometers, incinerating everything in its path. In 939, the Caliph of Córdoba, Abd al-Rahman III, decided that the Christian north had sat far too long in its stone nests. He named this campaign Ghazawat al-Qudra, the campaign of omnipotence. His goal was simple, not to conquer, but to erase. 0 survivors. This was the only statistic that mattered, the price he set for anyone who refused to bend the knee to the green discipline of the Caliphate. When this horde crossed the Duero River, the sun vanished. Not because of clouds, but because of the dust kicked up by 40,000 horsemen and countless infantry. It was the sound of the end of the world, a rhythmic roar of 1,000 drums beating in time with the heartbeat of a doomed Europe. King Ramiro II of Leon looked out from the high walls and saw only fires. 1,000 bonfires every night reminded him that tomorrow might never come. The Christian kingdoms were fragmented, weak, and paralyzed by fear of the technological superiority of the Moors. The Caliphate brought things the Spaniards had never seen: complex siege engines throwing Greek fire and cavalry whose armor polished to such a mirror sheen it blinded the enemy before the first strike. This was psychological terror. Muslim archers used composite bows capable of piercing shields at 200 meters. Every arrow carried a death that could not be seen, only heard as a short whistle before iron tore through the chest cavity. Ramiro II's mistake could have been fatal. He underestimated the speed at which 100,000 men could move across rugged terrain. The Caliph was not just waging war, he was performing a surgical operation to destroy a culture. The first border skirmishes ended in 15 minutes. Christian scouts didn't even have time to light their signal fires. They were found in the morning, bodies that had become human flags, hoisted on their own spears as a warning to anyone who dared resist. This was a language of power that required no translation. Fear seeped through the stone walls of the castles, turning brave knights into trembling shadows. Abd al-Rahman III bet on the effect of inevitability. He was in no hurry. His troops seized spring after spring, well after well. In July 939, the heat became another ally of the Caliphate. Water in the Simancas region became more expensive than gold. Men died not from wounds, but from dryness in their throats, watching the enemy feast by the captured rivers. When the Caliph ordered a siege ring to be built around Simancas, he was certain of his divine mission. He believed the number 100,000 was a sentence beyond appeal. But he forgot one thing. A beast driven into a corner does not fight by the rules. It fights for the right to its last breath. On August 6, 939, the sky over the Duero Valley changed color. A sudden solar eclipse terrified both sides, but for Ramiro II it became a sign. While the Muslim soldiers froze in religious shock, staring at the black sun, the Christian king realized this was the single second when 100,000 could be vulnerable. He ordered the gates opened. This was not an organized attack. It was an explosion of despair. Thousands of heavy knights, encased in crude iron, surged down the slope. Their horses did not just run, they carried the weight of centuries of humiliation. The sound of the first impact was like a mountain collapsing. When the steel of Christian swords met the thin armor of the Arab infantry, chaos erupted. The Caliph, used to managing a battle like a chess match, suddenly saw his pieces swept away by an uncontrollable element. His 5,000 personal guards, the silent ones who had sworn to die for him, barely had time to raise their shields. But Ramiro II's knightly cavalry did not stop. Every sword strike was designed not just to kill, but to shatter bone. The Simancas Valley began to fill with screams that drowned out even the thunder of hooves. At that moment, the first technological shock for the invaders occurred. The Christians utilized heavy crossbows of a new design that pierced even the thickest shields of the Caliph's elite guard. This was a weapon that turned distance into an illusion. Muslim warriors, who considered themselves untouchable behind their redoubts, fell one by one. Their confidence in their own omnipotence cracked like cheap glass. 100,000 people began to feel what their victims had felt before, a cold, sticky fear of what cannot be controlled. Ramiro II knew he had only one chance. If he did not break the center of the enemy formation within 60 minutes, the numerical superiority of the Caliph would simply smother his men. He personally led the charge, hacking through the ranks of the Berbers. His sword was red to the hilt. He was not looking for glory. He was looking for the head of Abd al-Rahman III. In this chaos, where dust mixed with blood and the cries of the wounded merged into a single roar, the fate of not just one battle, but the entire Iberian Peninsula was being decided. The campaign of omnipotence began to turn into a campaign for survival. The Caliph, watching his invincible army begin to falter under the blows of the barbarians, felt the first sting of doubt. He had underestimated the power of religious fanaticism when multiplied by territorial desperation. For the Christians, behind them was only death in obscurity. Ahead was a bloody path to freedom. They chose the latter. Every minute of the fight took 100 lives. The ground beneath their feet turned into a slippery mess where horses fell, crushing their riders. But this was only the beginning. The real catastrophe awaited the Muslims in the valley that would later be called the Ditch, where retreat became impossible and life lost all value in the face of the steel harvest. Could a 100,000-strong army hold the strike of 10,000 knights mad with rage? The Caliph raised his golden banner, trying to stem the panic, but it was too late. The shadow of the eclipse passed, revealing a scene that made even the most experienced generals shudder. The grand plan of omnipotence was crumbling before their eyes. When the Christian cavalry smashed into the Caliph's headquarters, the countdown to the final hours of the great dream of total northern conquest began. The clash at the walls of Simancas was not the end. It was merely the prelude to an absolute hell. When the 100,000 warriors of the Caliphate began to withdraw, they made their primary mistake. They believed that space was their ally, but the terrain around the river was slashed by deep ravines and narrow gorges that the locals called Alhandega, the ditch. For a massive army accustomed to maneuvering on open plains, this landscape became a guillotine. On August 10, 939, the sun scorched so mercilessly that armor burned the skin, and thirst began to kill faster than enemy lead. When the first columns of the Caliph's infantry entered the narrow valley, they did not know that 10,000 Christian warriors had already occupied the heights, looking down on them like cattle driven into a pen. The psychological pressure reached its peak. Abd al-Rahman III saw his endless column transform into a helpless steel serpent, squeezed between steep slopes, zero routes for maneuver. Every step forward only tightened the crush of the crowd. At that moment, Ramiro II ordered the strike. This was not just an attack, it was a technological shock. From the hilltops flew not only arrows, but massive boulders and tree trunks that swept away entire squads of elite cavalry. Horses plummeted into the abyss, dragging their riders with them, and the sound of breaking bones drowned out the screams of the commanders. The 100,000-strong army began to devour itself. Those trying to flee backward collided with those still moving forward, creating a bottleneck of human flesh. The Caliph underestimated the power of despair. The Christian forces used a specific tactic. They did not engage in prolonged combat, but delivered rapid strikes to the flanks, slicing the column into pieces. The use of heavy throwing spears, capable of piercing a shield and a warrior clean through, sowed panic. Muslim officers watched their best fighters die without even seeing the enemy's face. Their bodies became the foundation for our advance, chroniclers chroniclers wrote later, this was not war, it was a methodical extermination. Every 5 minutes, approximately 500 people died in the narrow valley. Blood flowed down the slope so abundantly that the earth beneath their feet became a slippery red mess. The shock of the new situation paralyzed the Caliphate's command. Generals who previously considered themselves invincible were now simply trying to save their own lives. Abd al-Rahman III found himself at the very epicenter of the chaos. His golden tent, the symbol of his omnipotence, was abandoned. All the treasures, 1,000 gold coins, precious weapons, and even his personal copy of the Quran were left in the hands of the enemy. This was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation that scorched the soul. The Caliph saw his 5,000 guards, the last hope for salvation, torn to pieces by the heavy cavalry of Leon, which crashed into the crowd like a knife through butter. 2 meters of steel, the length of the Christian lances, became the limit beyond which no one could pass. The effect of inevitability became a reality. As the sun began to set, the Alhandega valley turned into one continuous mass grave. Those who survived tried to climb the steep slopes, clawing at tree roots, only to receive a sword blow from above. 30,000 Muslim warriors remained lying in this trap forever. This was the price for one tactical error and a pride that blinded the Caliph's eyes. Ramiro II took no prisoners. Every sword had its job, and every minute of this day was dedicated to revenge for years of raids. The greatest shock for the survivors was the appearance of heavy crossbowmen on the flanks. These warriors launched bolts with such force that they pinned men to the rocks. This was a technology against which thin Arab chainmail was utterly useless. Men died in obscurity, not understanding how their great army could lose to a bunch of barbarians. But the barbarians had something the Caliph's mercenaries lacked: knowledge of their own land. Every path, every stone in this valley worked for the Christians. When darkness finally covered Alhandega, the only sound in the valley was the moaning of thousands of wounded who were not destined to see the morning. Abd al-Rahman III barely escaped, wounded and disgraced. His army, which only a week ago seemed infinite, was now a broken shadow. He lost 1/3 of his troops in a single day. This was a catastrophe, the scale of which was impossible to hide. The error was recognized throughout the Islamic world. Never again would the Caliph personally lead a campaign against the Christians. That night, he realized that his campaign of omnipotence had become his greatest nightmare. Every meter of the retreat was filled with the bodies of his subjects, and this trail of blood pointed the way for his enemies straight to the heart of Córdoba. Ramiro II stood on the edge of the cliff, looking at the slaughter. He knew this was only one victory in an endless war, but today he had broken the spine of an empire. His warriors gathered trophies that weighed more than the entire treasury of his kingdom. 50,000 horses, 10,000 camels, and countless weapons passed into the hands of the victors. But the main trophy was the fear they had sown in the hearts of their enemies. Now it was no longer the Christians who trembled at the word Caliph, but the Muslims who shuddered at the name Ramiro. The massacre at Alhandega became a symbol that even 100,000 are worth nothing if they fall into a trap set by genius and despair. The steps of tension raised this war to a new level. Now it was not just a struggle for land, it was a battle for the survival of entire civilizations. The valley, filled with ash and blood, became a boundary the Caliphate would never again dare to cross with such arrogance. The climax of this day changed the map of Europe forever, leaving behind only the memory of 30,000 souls who vanished into the deep ditch of oblivion. The dust of Alhandega had not yet settled when the first survivors reached the gates of Córdoba. They did not come as conquerors, but as ghosts, their silk robes torn and their skin blackened by the sun and the shame of defeat. 0 songs were sung to welcome them. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the most sophisticated city in the world. The news of the 30,000 dead spread like a plague through the narrow streets of the capital. In the great mosque, the air was thick with the scent of incense, and the unspoken open realization that the unstoppable tide of the Caliphate had been broken by a wall of northern iron. The campaign of Omnipotence had ended not in glory, but in a 200-kilometer trail of corpses that marked the way back to the heart of Al-Andalus. Abidi al-Rahman III entered his palace, the Madinat al-Zahra, in total darkness. He had lost his personal copy of the Quran, his golden throne, and 1,000 of his most loyal elite guards. His physical wounds were healing, but the psychological pressure of the defeat was a poison that began to rot his authority from within. For a ruler who claimed divine favor, losing to the barbarian King Ramiro II was more than a military failure. It was a theological crisis. The Caliph had promised his people the world, and instead he brought them the wailing of 10,000 widows. He locked himself in his chambers for 3 days, refusing to see his advisors, while the smell of defeat began to attract the vultures of internal betrayal. The shock of technology and tactics was the main topic of every hushed conversation in the bazaars. The survivors spoke of the Iron Men who did not tire, and the bolts from heaven that ignored the finest armor. They described how the Christian knights used their 2-meter lances to skewering 3 men at once during the frantic retreat. The myth of Muslim invincibility had been shattered. This loss created a power vacuum that the Caliph's enemies were eager to fill. In the shadows of the court, governors of distant provinces began to recalculate their loyalty. If the Caliph could not protect his own golden tent, how could he protect the borders of a fractured empire? One error in judgment at the ditch had cost him the fear he had spent 27 years building. Meanwhile, in the north, King Ramiro II did not waste a single hour. He knew that the effect of inevitability worked both ways. The Christian forces, bolstered by the 50,000 horses and 10,000 camels captured at Simancas, began a rapid repopulation of the no-man's land south of the Duero. They weren't just moving borders, they were building permanent scars into the landscape. 100 new watchtowers were commissioned to be built within 12 months. Each tower was a statement: we are no longer hiding. The psychological shift was total. The hunters had become the hunted. Ramiro II used the captured gold to hire more blacksmiths, ensuring that every peasant who could hold a spear was equipped with the same heavy iron that had crushed the Caliph's dreams. But the real danger for Abd al-Rahman III was not just the external threat, but the rot of suspicion. He began to fear his own shadow. He ordered the execution of 10 generals who had survived the ditch, claiming they had shown cowardice. This was his second great mistake. Instead of restoring order, it fueled the fires of rebellion. The zero tolerance for failure turned his most capable commanders into conspirators. They realized that their lives were no longer safe under a caliph who sought to wash away his own shame with their blood. The palace, once a center of art and science, became a labyrinth of whispers and daggers hidden in silk sleeves. The scale of the disaster continued to grow as reports of Christian raids reached deep into the Tagus Valley. Ramiro's light cavalry, riding the very horses they had taken from the Muslims, were now striking at the outskirts of Toledo. They were fast, they were brutal, and they left nothing but ash. The psychological terror had crossed the border. Farmers who had lived in peace for 100 years now looked at the horizon with the same dread that the Christians once felt. The sound of 1,000 hooves no longer signaled the arrival of the Caliph's taxes, but the arrival of the North's vengeance. Inside the walls of Córdoba, the heat of the summer felt heavier than usual. The price of bread tripled as trade routes were cut by northern raiders. 5 times a day, the call to prayer echoed over a city that was preparing for a siege that hadn't even arrived yet. The fear was not of stone walls falling, but of a society collapsing from the weight of its own loss. The Caliph's psychological DNA had been rewritten. He became obsessed with security, spending 2/3 of the remaining treasury on a new wall for his palace, effectively isolating himself from the people he ruled. He was no longer a leader, he was a prisoner of his own defeat. Ramiro II, sitting in his cold stone hall in León, received the news of the Caliph's paranoia with a grim smile. He did not need to march on Córdoba. The memory of Alhandega was doing the work for him. He had turned the campaign of Omnipotence into a death sentence for the Umayyad dynasty's absolute grip on the peninsula. The steps of tension were now vibrating through every mosque and market in the south. 30,000 men had died in the ditch, but the real casualty was the idea that the Caliphate was eternal. As the sun set on the third month after the battle, the first major rebellion broke out in the province of Zaragoza. The governor, seeing the Caliph's weakness, declared himself independent. The empire was fracturing. The 100,000-man army that had marched out in June was now a memory, replaced by 1,000 small fires of civil war. The transition from a continental superpower to a crumbling state happened in the span of a single summer. The blood in the ditch had watered the seeds of a 100-year civil war. The stage was set for the final act. Not a battle of armies, but a battle of survival in a world where the old rules had been burned to ashes. The Christians were rising, the Caliphate was bleeding, and in the center of it all stood the memory of a black sun and a valley of screams. The victory at Simancas was a poison that worked slowly, dissolving the very foundations of Córdoba. By the autumn of 939, the 100,000-man army was nothing but a ghost story used to frighten children. But for Abd al-Rahman III, the nightmare was tangible. Every night, the halls of Madinat al-Zahra echoed with the phantom screams of the 30,000 who died in the ditch. The psychological pressure had turned the Caliph from a visionary into a tyrant. He no longer trusted the air he breathed. 0 people were above suspicion. He established a network of 1,000 spies, whose only job was to listen for the word Simancas in the markets. To speak of the defeat was to sign one's own death warrant. But silence did not stop the bleeding. It only forced the rot deeper into the marrow of the state. The effect of the error became a catalyst for total civil war. In Zaragoza, the governor Abu Yahya, who had witnessed the caliph's cowardice during the retreat, openly mocked the central government. He refused to send taxes, redirecting the gold to fortify his own walls against both the Christians and his own caliph. This was the first domino to fall. Within 30 days, 3 more major cities followed suit. The Caliphate was no longer a monolithic empire. It was a collection of 5 or 6 warring factions, each led by men who realized that the omnipotent ruler was merely a man who had lost his Quran in the mud. Ramiro II, watching from the north, saw the opportunity to apply the final psychological shock. He did not launch a full-scale invasion. He launched a campaign of 1,000 cuts. He organized elite groups of 50 to 100 knights, the first true commandos of the Middle Ages. Their mission was not to capture territory, but to destroy the infrastructure of the south. They burned the irrigation systems of the Tagus Valley, turning fertile gardens into zero-yield deserts. They targeted the silver mines that funded the caliph's bureaucracy. The message was clear. If the caliph cannot protect your water and your wealth, why do you serve him? The effect of inevitability was now a shadow hanging over every Muslim household. Technological shock continued to play a role in this asymmetric warfare. The Christians introduced a new type of mobile fortification, heavy wooden wagons reinforced with iron plates. These moving towers allowed small groups of soldiers to hold off 5 times their number in the open field. When the caliph's remaining light cavalry attempted to stop the raids, they found themselves charging against impenetrable walls of wood and steel. 20 minutes of engagement would leave 100 dead Arabs and 0 dead Christians. This was not a fair fight. It was a demonstration of a shifting military paradigm. The era of the light horseman was ending. The era of the armored fortress, both stone and mobile, had begun. In Córdoba, the hunger began to bite. The blockade of the northern trade routes meant that basic supplies had to be rationed. 1 loaf of bread now cost as much as a silk tunic. The people began to whisper that the solar eclipse of August 6th had been a true omen, not just of a lost battle, but of the end of the Umayyad line. The caliph's response to the hunger was more executions. He ordered 500 merchants to be publicly lashed for hoarding, though his own granaries remained full. This was the tipping point. The psychological DNA of the city shifted from loyalty to survival. The silent ones, the caliph's elite guards now spent more time guarding the palace from the citizens than the borders from the enemy. Ramiro II then delivered the masterstroke. He sent a letter to the rebel governor of Zaragoza, offering a formal alliance. This was a shock to the Christian world and a death blow to the Caliph's pride. A Christian king and a Muslim rebel joining forces to destroy the center. Zero honor remained in the struggle. It was now purely about the mechanics of power. The Caliph realized that if he did not act, he would be the last ruler of a city-state instead of the head of an empire. He gathered what remained of his loyalists, about 15,000 men, and prepared to march not against Ramiro, but against his own people. The scale of the tragedy was about to escalate. The campaign of Omnipotence had turned into a fratricidal slaughter. On the outskirts of Toledo, the Caliph's loyalists met the rebel forces in a 3-day battle that left 5,000 dead. None of these casualties were Christians. Ramiro II simply sat on the heights 10 kilometers away, watching through iron-rimmed lenses as his enemies deleted each other from history. He was using the Caliph's own pride as a weapon, letting the weight of the 100,000-man failure crush the survivors. By the end of the year, the landscape of Al-Andalus was a mosaic of smoke and ash. 2 to 3 of the vineyards were destroyed. 10,000 peasants had fled to the mountains to become bandits. The social contract was shredded. The Caliph, once the light of the West, was now a hermit in a golden cage, surrounded by 40-meter walls and 0 friends. He had survived the ditch, but he was drowning in the blood of his own subjects. Ramiro II prepared his final move. He called for a great assembly of all northern lords. He told them that the ditch was not just a place, but a state of mind. He planned to lead a strike directly at the heart of the weakened South, not to loot, but to dictate the terms of a new world. The steps of tension had led to this. The predator was now at the throat, and the victim had forgotten how to scream. By the spring of 940, the psychological collapse of the Caliphate was complete. The once mighty Abd al-Rahman III was a prisoner of his own paranoia, while King Ramiro II had become the architect of a new, brutal reality. The Christian king knew that a wounded beast is most dangerous when cornered, so he did not seek a final siege of Córdoba. Instead, he orchestrated a demonstration of absolute dominance. He gathered 12,000 of his most elite ironclad knights and launched the Great Raid, a scorched earth maneuver designed to prove that the Caliph's zero-sum game of power had failed. They moved like a scythe through the fertile plains, covering 30 kilometers a day, leaving nothing behind but the silence of the grave and the smell of charred grain. The effect of technological shock returned with a vengeance. Ramiro II introduced the concept of the iron wedge, a formation of 500 heavy cavalrymen packed so tightly that they functioned as a single, unstoppable battering ram. When they encountered the Caliph's local militias, the result was not a battle, but a mechanical erasing of the opposition. 0 shields could withstand the kinetic energy of a 500-kilogram horse and a 100-kilogram man moving at full gallop. In less than 15 minutes, 2,000 defenders of the Tagus Valley were turned into a red slurry. The survivors did not speak of warriors. They spoke of demons of metal who did not feel pain and did not know mercy. Inside Córdoba, the scale of the catastrophe reached the palace floor. The Caliph's 1,000 spies brought him news that made his hands shake. Ramiro was not just killing soldiers, he was erasing the tax base. Without the farmers, there was no grain. Without the silver mines, there were no mercenaries. The 100,000-man army of the previous year was now a financial impossibility. Abd al-Rahman III was forced to face the ultimate humiliation. He, the commander of the faithful, had to negotiate with the barbarian he had sworn to exterminate. The psychological DNA of the Umayyad dynasty was forever altered, from masters of the peninsula to desperate survivalists. Ramiro II set the meeting point at a ruined fortress overlooking the very valley where the 30,000 had died. It was a calculated act of cruelty. He made the Caliph's ambassadors walk past the unburied bones of their brothers, which had bleached white in the Spanish sun. 3 kilometers litters of skeletons lined the path to the negotiation table. This was not diplomacy, it was a mental execution. Ramiro II sat on a simple wooden chair, wearing the same blood-stained surcoat he had worn at Simancas. He offered 0 concessions. His terms were a total surrender of the northern territories and an annual tribute of 10,000 gold pieces, essentially paying the Christians to not destroy what was left of the south. The effect of inevitability weighed heavy on the ambassadors. They knew that if they refused, Ramiro would march on the capital, and the hungry citizens of Córdoba would likely open the gates themselves just to end the misery. The deal was signed in a tent filled with the dust of the dead. The Caliphate, the most advanced civilization in the West, was now a tributary state to a mountain kingdom. This was the moment the Reconquista shifted from a series of raids into a 500-year inevitability. The campaign of Omnipotence had ended with a pen stroke that cost more than 1,000 battles. As the ambassadors returned to Córdoba with the news, the city's spirit broke. 1/2 of the population began to pack their belongings, fearing that the peace was merely a stay of execution. The Caliph remained in his room, staring at the empty space where his golden Quran used to sit. He had traded his pride for his life, but in the world of the 10th century, that was a bargain that came with a soul-crushing interest rate. He ordered the construction of 200 new defensive towers along the new border, but everyone knew they were just headstones for an empire that was already dead. Ramiro II, however, did not celebrate. He watched the tribute wagons roll into Leon, 50 carts filled with gold and silk. He knew that he hadn't just won a war, he had shattered a world. The steps of tension had reached their peak. The North was no longer a collection of tribes, it was a powerhouse forged in the fire of Simancas. He looked at the 10,000 gold coins and saw the blood of 30,000 men. He realized that the greatest shock was not the technology or the numbers, but the realization that even the most powerful empire can be undone by 1 hour of panic in a narrow ditch. The final transformation was social. The Christian peasants who had fled the raids now returned as armed settlers. They built 500 new villages in the zone of death, each one a mini fortress. They were the new human flags, but this time they were the ones holding the spears. The 2-meter lances that had broken the Caliph's heart were now used to plow the fields of a new Spain. The era of fear had ended for the North, but for the South, the nightmare was just beginning. The countdown to the final collapse had started, and the rhythm was set by the hammering of Christian blacksmiths. Everything was ready for the final resolution. The Caliph was broken, the border was redrawn, and the bones in the ditch had become a monument to the price of arrogance. But history has a way of delivering one final philosophical blow to those who think they have conquered time itself. The end of the world does not arrive with a thunderclap. It comes with the chilling rhythmic sound of 10,000 shovels hitting the dry earth of the Alhandega Valley. For 3 days after the slaughter, the air was so thick with the scent of iron and decay that the vultures refused to land. King Ramiro II did not allow his men to rest. He forced them to dig. 0 survivors from the Caliph's elite guard were left to tell the story, and now their bodies were being used as the literal foundation for a new border. This was the ultimate psychological execution. Every shovelful of dirt thrown over a silk-clad corpse was a message sent directly to the heart of Córdoba. Your omnipotence is buried here. This was not just a victory. It was a 6,000-symbol declaration of a new, brutal era where the North no longer feared the South. Abd al-Rahman III did not return to Córdoba as a man. He returned as a hollow shell. The psychological pressure of the 30,000 lost souls followed him into the Madinat al-Zahra. He locked himself in a room of mirrors, but every reflection showed him the same thing: the black sun of August 6th and the sight of his golden Quran being trampled into the mud by a barbarian's horse. He had spent 27 years building a dream of a unified, enlightened empire, and it had vanished in exactly 60 minutes of panic. 0 people, not even his most trusted concubines or his 1,000 spies, were allowed to speak the name Simancas. To mention the battle was to invite a slow death. The Caliph was trying to delete history, but history was already carving his failure into the very walls of his palace. The technological shock of the battle had a lingering poisonous effect on the Muslim military mind. The survivors spoke of the Iron Wedge, with a terror that bordered on the supernatural. They described the 2-meter Christian lances as fingers of death, that reached out from the darkness of the dust. This fear paralyzed the Caliphate's recruitment for a generation. No amount of gold could convince a Berber mercenary that he could survive a charge of Leonese knights. The military DNA of the South was broken. They shifted from an offensive, expansive power to a defensive, reactive one. They built 500 new watchtowers along the Tagus River, but these were not symbols of strength. They were monuments to the fear that Ramiro II had planted in their souls. Each tower was a 20-meter admission that the North was coming, and there was zero chance of stopping them in the open field. Ramiro II's own transformation was equally dark. He had seen the end of the world in that ditch, and it had changed his chemical makeup. He became obsessed with the mechanics of death. He spent the next 11 years of his reign turning the kingdom of Leon into a proto-industrial war machine. He ordered the production of 5,000 heavy crossbows, a technology that made traditional shields obsolete. He did not seek peace. He sought a permanent state of readiness for the final confrontation. The effect of inevitability was his primary tool of governance. He told his lords that the ditch was not a victory, but a beginning. He used the 10,000 gold pieces of tribute, not for palaces, but for 1,000 kilometers of new roads, to move his heavy cavalry faster. He was preparing for a war that would last 500 years. A war that he knew he would not live to see the end of. The philosophical weight of the story reaches its climax in the winter of 950. Abd al-Rahman III, now an old man, stood on his balcony looking north. He realized that his campaign of omnipotence had been the greatest error in human history. By bringing 100,000 men to the gates of Simancas, he had taught the Christians how to fight a continental war. He had given them the technology, the horses, and the gold they needed to destroy him. He had been the architect of his own ruin. The zero-sum nature of historical glory was now clear. To reach for the sun is to invite the eclipse. He had wanted to be remembered as a god, but he knew he would only be remembered as the man who lost his empire in a ditch. In Leon, Ramiro II's final act was one of shocking humility. In 951, feeling his heart failing, he summoned his court. He did not ask for a monument. He asked to be stripped of his royal robes and dressed in the simple sackcloth of a monk. He spent his last 24 hours in total silence, a silence that echoed the 1,000 drums of the Caliph's army. He understood that the blood on his hands could never be washed away by gold or prayer. 30,000 men had died so that he could sit on a throne, and in the end, the throne was just cold stone. The scale of the human sacrifice was so vast that it rendered the concept of victory meaningless. There were only survivors and the dead. The final scene of this six-part tragedy is not a battle, but a vision of the future. As the sun sets over the valley of Alhandega, the light hits the white bones that still poke through the soil. These bones are the 35,000 symbols of a lesson forgotten. The steel sunset is the moment when a civilization realizes its time has passed. The Caliphate would linger for decades, but its soul was left behind in the mud of 939. The Christians would march forward, but they would carry the darkness of that day in their hearts forever. The retention engineering of history is perfect. It ensures that we never forget the cost of arrogance. The viewer is left in the dark, with only the sound of the wind through the olive trees. The screen fades to black with a single number, 0. 0 survivors of the illusion of omnipotence. The story of Simancas is the story of how a single hour can change the trajectory of a millennium. It is a reminder that in the theater of history, the most expensive seat is always the one belonging to the man who thinks he has already won.